Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining this webinar from different parts of the world. And thank you for joining us for this very, very important conversation on why EU mandatory due diligence legislation must include home workers. This webinar has been jointly organized by HomeNet International, its sister organizations, HomeNet South Asia, HomeNet Southeast Asia, WIEGO, Home Worker Worldwide, and Traidcraft Exchange. In February 2022, which is pretty much now, over 100 companies and investors released a joint statement addressed to EU policymakers. One of the 5 principles of the statement is that due diligence obligation should extend across the full value chain. On this Wednesday, EU Commission released its draft directive, which includes references to due diligence obligations covering the full value chain. We welcome this move, but there is definitely more that can be done. Today's webinar will focus on workers' rights at the very bottom of the garment and footwear supply chains, which are the women home workers. Before we start this webinar, I wanted to briefly talk about who are these home-based workers that we're talking about. Home-based workers are workers who work from in and around their homes, producing goods and or providing services. As per the recent ILO statistics, there are over 260 million home-based workers across the world, representing 8% of the global workforce. And this number has only grown during the pandemic. So we're talking about a large section of the workforce who are mainly women. There are also 2 categories of home-based workers. First, the own-account home-based workers who have direct access to raw materials and markets. A good example of own-account home-based workers are the home-based workers making clothes and footwear from their own homes and selling it directly to the customers. The second category of home-based workers are the subcontracted home workers who are contracted directly by factories, through contractors, or by workshops. The factory provides the raw materials, stipulates what must be made and by when. Home workers are paid on a piece rate basis. In today's webinar, we are going to focus on the second category of home-based workers, which are the home workers, and especially the home workers who are part of the global garment and footwear supply chains. Home workers across the world, and especially in South and Southeast Asia, are the hidden labor force of the global garment and footwear supply chains. They don't have contracts, and factories do not keep official records of home workers to whom they subcontract. To understand home workers and garment supply chains better, we would like to show a 3-minute short video. I'd request my team to please play the video.
Fast fashion rules the global garment industry, rapidly churning out low-cost trends. This has given birth to global supply chains that crisscross continents and nations, involving many people at different stages of production. At the very top of this chain sits the retailer or brand that designs products, brands, and markets them. A regional sourcing office for the brand then contracts suppliers, coordinates on designs and costing, and assures compliance. Suppliers or manufacturers can be big export houses and factories. They take charge of all aspects of manufacturing. Brands can hire many manufacturers in many countries, and suppliers can produce for more than one brand. To keep up with demand and timelines, large manufacturers subcontract work. This is usually where the lines blur on compliance. Contractors and subcontractors take on excess work, fulfilling orders in small production units or through home workers. At the bottom of the supply chain are home workers who get work through a contractor or a series of contractors and are often unaware of the brand they are working for. They are provided with the raw material and are given work instructions and earn piece rates. Home workers take up various jobs. These can be skilled jobs like embroidery, weaving, or stitching, or low-end work like finishing, ironing, or packing. During peak season, home workers work long hours to fulfill orders on time in exchange for low piece rates. They take on significant costs and risks of production, including paying for electricity and equipment and foregoing payments when contractors reject pieces made. Poor working conditions result in health problems, and they also face violence and harassment at the hands of their contractors. Often, home workers do not receive adequate work through the year. They remain invisible and command little bargaining power. However, without home workers, the global garment industry would come to a standstill. Their skilled handwork adds sheen to the garments. And it is their value additions that make products marketable. Acknowledging these invisible workers will go a long way in making fashion ethical and for all.
Thank you, HomeNet South Asia, for that very, very clear video. And I hope this simple video made it easy to visualize the home workers and their work in the global supply chains. Now, let us start with today's webinar. The objective of today's webinar is to show why home workers should be included in the EU mandatory due diligence legislation, both at the directive and the national level, and how this can be done, and to show how businesses can include home workers as stakeholders in the supply chains and how due diligence can be extended to include home workers. To talk more about this in this webinar, I'm joined by my sisters from Pakistan, India, South Africa, and UK. These sisters have years of experience working with home workers, both at the grassroots as well as with other stakeholders, including businesses and the governments. We will start with the question and answer session with Sister Vyakula Mary and Sister Zahra Khan, who will provide their inputs from India and Pakistan respectively. This will be followed by a presentation by Marlies Swan-Thompson, who will address the questions on why EU directives and national legislation should cover the home workers. And then Lucy Brill from Homeworker Worldwide will address MSIs and brands and show why and how brands can and should incorporate home workers in their due diligence. She will also launch a toolkit. This will be followed by question and answer from the audience. I will encourage the audience to keep putting your questions in the Q&A box as well as the chat box. Let me first invite Sister Vyakula Mary. Sister Mary is the Executive Director of SAVE, which is a not-for-profit organization based in Tirupur in India, focusing on elimination of child labor, empowerment of women and youth, and promotion of ethical labor standards in the garment and textile industry. SAVE has also registered a trade union organizing over 30,000 women home-based workers in Tirupur. Just to let the audience here know that Tirupur is a garment hub where the city collectively makes garments for the global as well as the domestic brands, and not only from factories, but also from very small workshops as well as from the workers' own homes. I'm sure Sister Mary can talk a lot more about it, so let's ask her directly. Sister Mary, can you tell us about the garment supply chains in Tirupur and about home workers in these supply chains? Over to you, Sister Mary.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for introducing me. Tirupur is already everyone aware of it. Tirupur is a t-shirt factory of the world. Have identified 400 brands sourcing for global and local. The home workers are not getting the order directly from the factory. The order directly from the factory, any order which they receive will have minimum 3 to 5 middle agents in the chain. The cost cutting measures will be there in every steps. Finally, it reaches home based workers. obviously the cost for them will be low. The product can get directly from the factory, but as per the brand's code of conducts and norms, etc., it should not come down to the home-based workers directly. So it is rooted in the different channel. The home-based workers are doing the task of quality checking of the garments, trimming means pruning the unwanted threads, segregation of the waste garment cloths, unraveling the waste cloth, cone winding, etc. is being made by the home-based workers in Tirupur. The home is a workplace for the home-based workers. They have to perform this task amidst of caring the children and elders in round the clock. She has to complete her task whatever is demanded by the agent. She used to feel as fatigued several times. She has a lack of bargaining power and she is involved in low paid job. Contractors' domination will be there in the payment of the wage, abuses, she has to face it. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, they are the most vulnerable community in Tirupur. 100% of the factories were shut down and the movement is also restricted. Volume of the order has reduced even after opening the factory. The pandemic period was also extended. The biggest issues are out of cash, which is resulted in lack of purchasing for the basic needs of food, even for the children. In such a situations, SAVE has done supplied with the dry ration along with the hygienic kits for once in a 15 days. And the workers were also linked with the existing government support. Counseling and guidance were done to get admission in the COVID care center and the family were supported with millets. These are all the mainly we are looking into the major situation in the garment supply chains.
Thank you, Sister Mary, for actually explaining the different nature of work done by home workers, but also the impact of the pandemic on home workers, as well as linking it with the issues of hunger and the issues of violence. So thank you for giving a broad overview on that. Now, we also understand that home workers working in garment supply chains in Tirupur are not recognized and protected by labor law in India. What efforts have SAVE made to protect home workers? Sister Mary, you're on mute.
Yeah, good. Sorry. Yes. Good. Thank you so much. SAVE as a SAVE and Anugadam, organizing workers into Anugadam Unorganized Workers Welfare Union and other existing 7 strong unions also. Continuous dialogues with other supply chain stakeholders of contractors, agent and the factory management. Some extent with the clothing brands also continuing. With the government to recognize the workers, we are continuously doing the lobby and advocacy with them. Counseling and guidance was given for domestic violence and also linked them with the existing government grievance redressal mechanism of local committee to handle sexual harassment, 181 helpline number and Sakti one-stop center, which is an existing government system, deals with all sorts of violence against women, is introduced to all the home-based workers and also extended our support to access for remedy.
Thank you.
Work sorry.
Go ahead.
Work,
Sorry.
yeah, work transparency tool is also introduced in the form of registering their work in the passbooks. Both workers and the material distribution agent also have to uh, remark it in the notebook, in the passbook, so that the transparency can be followed. However, still we have to go long way as brands need to be made responsible.
Thank you, Sister Mary, for also talking about, the different stakeholders that you have in the supply chain and how you're engaging with each level of the supply chain stakeholders. You also talked about the transparency tools and some of the challenges. I'm sure there'll be more questions around it, and we will get back to you again. Now, let me move to and ask questions to our second panelist, Sister Zara Khan. Sister Zara is the founder and general secretary of Home-Based Women Workers Federation, which is the first ever trade union of home-based workers in Pakistan. She's experienced in organizing home-based workers, women garment workers, and training workers on diverse issues. She is a member of the Sindh Home-Based Workers Governing Body, the Sindh Minimum Wage Board, the Sindh Tripartite Labor Standing Committee, and the Occupational Health and Safety Committee. Sister Zara, your organization has fought for the legislation in the Sindh province that recognizes home workers and supply chain as supply chain workers entitled to labor rights and social protection. Could you tell us how this was achieved?
Hi, everyone. Janvi, it's a long story and a struggle based on more than 12 years, which I am not be able to describe in just a short time. But one thing for which I, as a home-based workers, must be proud of by saying that we have took up the issue of home-based workers as a class issue, rather just considering it only a gender issue. And this vision led us to our success and worked closely with the Labor Department and legislators, due to which the Sindh province passed the law and gave home-based worker the status of the labor. The important step in our struggle was how to bring these home-based workers under the preview of the labor laws. As home-based workers were not fall under the definition of labor because of their employer invisibility, and even their workplace in most is not defined in any law as establishment. So because in Pakistani laws, it is important for the workers to work in the certain place which belong to the employer, and on that ground, the worker related with the employer. So the link between employer and employee was missing due to the contractualization of the work. So therefore, the most important thing for us, after awareness among raising awareness among the home-based workers and organizing these home-based workers in the trade union and building their pressure group, was home-based workers identification as worker, for which we had to come on the street to show our visibility, our existence, and this is the history. So in 2019, in 9th May 2018, legislation was made and approved by the Sindh Assembly. And this is the first ever history, you can say, in Pakistan and even the South Asia, that the Sindh Assembly recognized 100,000 home-based workers in Sindh as a worker. But there is still much more work to be done. Home-based workers got their identity with this law, but there is still a long battle for getting the minimum wage, or going to the get the living wage, social security protection in the social security registration with the pension scheme, and to build a conflict resolution mechanism. And we are still struggling for it, and somehow we are getting the positive result as well. Like in glass bangle industry, we were able to fix their wages and put their glass bangle home-based workers in the gazette of Sindh Minimum Wage Board. And even we are working on the calculation of wages for the garment workers. So this is how we worked for the legislation.
Thank you, Zeraji. And we understand this entire 12 years of journey. It's not easy to summarize it in 5 minutes. But
Yes.
can I ask you a follow-up question? Is you've touched upon it, but can you tell us what are some of the main features of this legislation?
Okay. The main thing is that these extreme bottom of supply chain workers are recognized by the law as worker. So this is the main part of this law. Home-based workers include in the definition of worker, even their workplace like home included in the establishment definition, and their employer are also defined as their employer. Now the contractor, middleman, and the main employer all become the main employer of these home-based workers. The second main part of this law is the formation of a dispute resolution mechanism. As you all know, that worker in the informal sector are not heard or have any platform if there is any dispute arise with their employer or any problem arise during the work. They don't have any place to fix the issue. So because of their invisibility in the supply chain, so their employer is not detectable, so they could not register their work related complaint anywhere. They don't have any platform. So and now home-based worker can also file their case with the arbitration committee, which will be set up under the law, through which home-based workers can complain and find their solution. This law also gives home-based workers a right to sue their case in the labor court as well. Before that, this we were not allowed to go even the labor court. So this in this law we can also go to the labor court if they are not satisfied with the arbitrary committee's decision. Home-based workers are also eligible for taking social benefits under this law. This is also the main part that now we can register ourselves with the social security scheme, and even we can get the pension and other benefits which the other workers are getting under the law. They can also benefit from the minimum wage, because now we are included in the sin minimum wage board act as well. So they have to finalize or fix the home-based workers' wages determined by the law. So as we get success in getting glass bangle, like I said, I told you before that the glass bangle industry, the wages are fixed in the gazette of sin minimum wage, and now we are working on calculating wages for the garment workers. Another main part of this law is that the government will allocate seed money for welfare of the home-based workers by creating the fund for them. And we can also make the union. So these are some main points which is included in our law.
Right. Thank you, Zeraji. And you've also talked about the struggle for getting this legislation, but also the follow-up struggle and making this legislation practical. You know, you talked about dispute resolution and things like that. I'm sure there's a lot of work that is still going on around it.
Yes.
And you're paving way for a lot of, Asian countries to follow what you have done in Pakistan. So thank you for explaining that. I have one additional question, which is that, we'd like to know what are the key demands of home workers working in the global supply chain from Pakistan?
Like garment sector is one of the major export-oriented sector in Pakistan, which covers 70 to 75% of the market. Therefore, it is imperative that all the workers be included in the law and be brought under the preview of the law. When we have the GSP plus status, we have the global framework agreement and many ILO convention, and even big brand have agreement with the trade union, but they are not being implemented. If it is not being implemented in the factory, then how will they provide all the facilities to the workers of the supply chain, whom the majority are not visible? So for me, the most important thing is that the labor law should be applied or extended to the whole supply chain workers. And this is our basic demand with the EU as well. Secondly, considering home-based workers as a part of the supply chain is the most important thing, which is very difficult process to monitor. They need recognition. Their employer should be visible. So I think the transparency is transparency in whole supply chain must need it. Purchasing must be democratic, we can say this, or we need to know where the work is being done and from where it's coming, which is not yet clear. Even worker didn't know about their employer for whom they are working in actual. There should be no violation of labor rights anywhere in the whole supply chain, which can be only achieved with the transparency. So we need to know our employer and from where we are working or where our work is going, basically. Workers get the living wage. It should be declared as an important issue that no worker earn less than the living wage. This is also important thing, and we are demanding for it as well in Pakistan and struggling for it as well. And the fourth one is that the universalization of the social security is our top priority. So everyone can be protected under this universalization of the social security scheme. As we are saying that that worker right are the human right, but these workers neither access to the healthcare facilities nor the education, which is the violation of the human right. So these are the basic things on which we are working as well, and we are demanding in Pakistan.
Thank you, Zara-ji, and I'm sure Sister Mary would also agree. The issues are very similar in other South Asian countries, also be it India, Bangladesh, Nepal. So thank you for that, and pointing out about the importance of transparency in the supply chains and living wages, and all this points towards the need for the due diligence and the right. So let me just now move on further to the next panelist, Sister Zara and Sister Mary. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming for you, and I already see a lot of them coming in the chat box. I'm really tempted to ask you to answer immediately, but let's come back to it. And now we have two esteemed panelists. Let me start by inviting Sister Marlies von Bromsen. Marlies is the first law program director at WIEGO. Marlies holds law degrees from University of Cape Town and Harvard Law School, and an MA in Development Studies from University of Western Cape. Prior to joining WIEGO, Marlies was the visiting researcher at the Institute for Global Law and Policy, Harvard Law School. Marlies has also held teaching positions at the University of Cape Town, Northeastern USA, and the Western Cape. In today's presentation, Marlies will address the question of why EU directive and national legislation should include home workers. Over to you, Marlies.
Thanks very much, Janvi. And I was actually hoping to share a photograph. Let me try and quickly do that, which is such a wonderful photograph. Can you see my screen? Can people see my screen? No.
No, Marlies, we can't. You may want to try again.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So I'm not even sharing the full photograph. It's a huge photograph of just thousands and thousands of women. And this is the Home-Based Workers Federation in Pakistan. So maybe we can share some photos later. Let me see if I can, not quite sure how to do that. Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with a PowerPoint, if I may. Let me just get my... Okay, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, and thank you for joining us on a Friday. I'm going to be looking at why human rights due diligence legislation should cover informal home workers. And I'm going to try and speak slowly for translators, but let me know if I'm speaking too fast. So in November 2021, 7 networks across, let me start with this. In February 2021, 12 home worker organizations submitted this platform of demands, the document that you see on your left, to the EU Commission as part of its consultative process. And then on the 9th of November 2021, HomeNet International, HomeNet South Asia, HomeNet Southeast Asia, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, which includes 34 trade unions across several Asian countries, the Pakistan Home-Based Workers Federation, Pakistan Trade Union, and WIEGO submitted an open letter to EU policymakers. And we sent this letter to every single commissioner. And this letter raises two key arguments. The first is that the directive should cover all workers in all tiers of the chain, both factory workers and subcontracted workers in workshops and at home. And the second set of arguments address the issue of access to justice, and particularly plead for a gender-based, gender-sensitive and comprehensive access to justice that considers justice from below. But we're of course looking at the first issue today. So I'm going to briefly look at four things. One, why the directive must go beyond factories. Two, why home workers must be included. How could home workers be included from a statutory perspective? And finally, some demands by home worker organizations. I'm going to cover four reasons or four arguments why the directive must go beyond factories. And this is the first reason. So if national legislation or the directive only covers factory workers or only covers tier one, and of course we know this is a draft proposal that's gone out that has to be settled now between the council, the commission and the parliament. So the first argument is that it would ignore the real structure of the chain. This is a diagram of a supply chain in Tirupur, India. I'm just wanting to. So on your right-hand side, you'll see at the top is the global brand. It then signs an agreement with the first tier supplier, which typically has around 1,500 workers, which subcontracts to a second tier supplier, which has approximately 400 workers. And then there are two possible routes of subcontracting. So on your left-hand side, or my left-hand side, the second tier supplier would subcontract to workshops, which employ between 10 and 80 workers. And these workshops would then subcontract further to much smaller workshops that employ between 1 and 10 workers. And those small workshops would then subcontract to home workers. The other way in which these second tier suppliers subcontract is to a contractor, which is often a single person, who would then subcontract to several subcontractors, and usually that's somebody who's in the community. Now on your left-hand side, you'll see that those are the figures for the whole of India. And this draws on a 2018 paper that has analyzed labor force statistics across India in the garment sector. And you'll see the figures for the first and second tier suppliers together employ 12.9 million workers. The workshops, the bigger workshops that employ between 10 and 80 people, employ 6.6 million workers. And then the small workshops, a huge 16.3 million. And then home workers, where there's an estimated 5 million workers that are employed. So almost 90% of workers are employed outside of factories. A 2019 study by Professor Mark Anna, who surveyed 340 garment factories in Delhi, showed that 58% of those factories outsourced to home workers. So lest you think this is just in India, in Indonesia, and I'm basing this on an ILO paper in 2015, which is of course pre-pandemic. The National Labour Force Survey shows that only 29.4% of workers in factories have permanent contracts. At 25.8% are engaged on fixed term contracts and are usually hired through an intermediary. And then trade unions estimate that approximately 44.8% of textile workers are outsourced workers. So again, a very large percentage of workers are outside of factories. So of course, the point here is that if we are only protecting workers in factories through the legislation, then we're missing a lot of the chain. There's a second reason why we should be supporting legislation to include all workers in all tiers of the chain. And that is because it will, if we don't, we drive further informalization of work. So what do I mean by informalization? And I've drawn on a typology which is useful, which is by Colin Fenwick and Ingrid Landau. It's an ILO paper. So we know that there are 4 characteristics of the standard employment contract. So the standard employment means it's permanent, full-time, there's direct supervision on the employer's premises, and there's a bilateral relationship or contractual relationship between the employer and the employee that's not intermediated by anyone else. So if you have got a standard employment contract, then you typically covered fully by labor law, and it triggers the full suite, as it were, of labor law rights. So if an employer compromises any one of these 4, then it's non-standard employment, which might be partially covered in some countries, is covered by legislation, but in no case do the non-standard employers, I'm talking about Asia, in Asian countries, do they have full employment rights. So it could be, instead of being permanent, temporary, which in factories means it's fixed, people on a fixed term contract for a season, for a month, for a week, for a particular contract, or casual workers who paid by the piece. They could be part-time, they're off the premises, so you subcontracted. And finally, you could be engaged through an intermediary, so a labor broker, or in the case of home workers, what is colloquially known as a contractor. So a home worker can suffer 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those features of non-standard employment. They could be permanent, but they might be part-time, off the premises, and engaged through a contractor, for example. So this slide serves to remind us of the supply chain dynamics. And you'll see at the top is the idea of a brand, in the middle is the picture of the factory, and at the bottom the workers. And it's well known to most of you, the features of brands and retailers' purchasing practices, namely in the fashion industry, namely very tight deadlines, price pressures, and fluctuating demands. I went to a really interesting panel as part of this forum by the New Conversations project at Cornell on fluctuating demand and the effect that has on factories. So factories are then under pressure to pass some of these costs down to their workers. And typically, and this is well documented in the literature, there are 2 key mechanisms to do that. So the one mechanism is to demand overtime pay from your workers and to increase the intensity of work so that each individual worker has to produce more goods within an hour. And the other strategy is to subcontract. And through subcontracting, you can then download the costs and risks onto workers. And Mary spoke about some of those. And the little video showed us as well. The fact that home workers bear the cost of electricity, they have to buy the sewing machine, they have to pay for space, etc. The Clean Clothes Campaign study of 40 factories in 8 garment and footwear producing countries found that it's very common practice for suppliers to maintain one factory that complies with codes while subcontracting to unaudited factories. And a Cornell study in 2021 that interviewed something like 38 auditors revealed that auditors know this is ubiquitous throughout supply chains. And this practice will both continue and it will intensify if the due diligence fails to cover the whole chain. So question then is, why support home workers specifically? And I want to make 4 arguments here. And it's important because I think often the argument is that we should ban homework, that homework might be a site of child labor, and that all workers should get into factories. So what we are not saying is that informal or outsourced work is bad. What we're saying is that it should be decent. So these are the reasons why one should support homework. So first is women can, by working at home, combined work and reproductive responsibilities. So in focus groups in India and Thailand with home workers, they argued that 12-hour days leave them with far too little time to fulfill their household and social responsibilities. They argued they needed time to work from home to care for their children, their grandchildren, and sick or disabled relatives. So the second reason is that older women can participate in the labor market. And by older, I mean like 30-something-year-olds. In India, 80% of factory workers are between the ages of 16 and 25. In Cambodia, 95% are under the age of 35. In Vietnam, the average worker is 25 years old. In Indonesia, factory workers are forced to resign when they turn 50. We don't have data for Thailand, but we know that most factory workers, home workers, are older women that are laid off by factories. And in focus groups with Thai home workers, they say that Thai factories do not hire people over 40. So thirdly, it enables women who live in villages to participate in the labor market. So in many cases, the contractors drive outside of cities and they deliver the raw materials to women who are in villages, and they collect the finished goods again. And without that, village women would not be able to participate in the labor market. And then women who cannot leave home because of cultural or religious norms, they too can then participate in the labor market. And finally, and this was a point made by the wonderful video, was that many home workers are artisans. I mean, they are doing work that cannot be done in factories. And I know Nest is here that support women like that, who, for example, do embroidery or screen printing. So the third argument for including all workers in the supply chain is that the costs of labor rights for factory workers will be borne by workers at the bottom of the chain if we don't cover everybody. There's a wonderful 2012 study by Barrientos, Garefi, and Rossi, and they disaggregated the supply chain into different categories of workers. And they concluded that if labor rights are only for some and not for all workers, the costs of upgrading, as it were, some workers' terms and conditions of work is borne not by the brands, not by the factories, but by other workers who are not covered by audits or by legislation. And usually these are the informal workers in factories, and they're the subcontracted workers in workshops and at home. So let me move on to the next subject matter, which is how can legislation include home workers? And I see I've got a minute and a half, so I'll have to be quick. So the OECD guidance has a module 12, which has got really good framework for how to include home workers. The Australian legislation is the flagship legislation of how to, in a statutory sense, include home workers. And just a little advert, WIEGO and the International Lawyers Assisting Workers are doing a webinar in April on the Australian legislation. So if you're interested, contact me and I'll send you an invitation. And then finally, there's a home workers platform of demands, which we can share with you in the chat, which sets out the demands of home workers in this context. So here's just something on the OECD guidance drawn from module 12. But just briefly to say that legislation can make it mandatory for enterprises to include a provision in their contracts with their primary suppliers to keep a register of home workers and copies of contracts, and require each tier of the chain to do the same. So it's a cascade effect. Each tier requires the tier below contractually, so it's a legal obligation to comply. And that's really the basic structure of the Australian model, although the Australian model's got some really interesting enforcement mechanisms. It's not perfect, but I would encourage you to certainly to read the OECD and the platform of demands. So just finally, to talk about home workers' demands in the context of the EU legislation and the legislative process in Europe. The first is that there's meaningful consultation. As you can see from this webinar, home workers across the world are organized. And what I saw a question in the chat, what I mean by organized, they're not acting individually. They're acting together, they're forming organizations where their countries don't permit them to be trade unions. They are organized in cooperatives, and are also organized in trade unions. And they, more than anyone, know what their conditions are. Secondly, they are demanding transparency, and part of transparency is that the brand is transparent about their supply chain. So often home workers are threatened that they'll lose their work if they try and map a supply chain, or if they try and identify who the brands are that they produce for. And so they need contracts with the name of the brand in the contract. And that leads to the third point, which is access to justice. If you don't know who you produce for, you can't even avail yourself of any complaints or grievance mechanism. And so in the context of access to justice, and I won't actually take up time, but they're concerned that these access to justice mechanisms, that they must participate in how complaints and grievance mechanisms are designed. So finally, I want to finish off with this, and I think it leads in very nicely into Lucy's presentation, which is just the logos of the over 100 brands and investors that came out in support of the EU legislation when it looked as if the directive was flailing. And one of the 5 sort of pillars of their demands is that it should cover the whole chain. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Marlies, and thank you for putting it all so simply. We find all these issues so complex sometimes, but making it very simple and providing these 4 key reasons why the directive must go beyond the factories. First one being, we drive further informalization. Second, it ignores the real structure of the supply chain where most of the workers are outside the factories. And, I like the fact that you talk about all informal workers within the supply chain, including home workers, because there are many of them, right? You've also talked about cost of improving labor rights of some workers will be done by other workers. So that's a very important message. And lastly, including home workers is a gender issue. So it's a labor issue, it's a gender issue, it's a human rights issue. So thanks a lot for that presentation. And now I'd like to invite Lucy. Sister Lucy Brill from Homeworker Worldwide is the director of Homeworker Worldwide. She joined the organization in the year 2017, initially researching precarious working conditions in UK garment manufacturing, and later leading Homeworker Worldwide's work in South Asia with brands sourcing leather footwear and clothing from homeworker supply chains. Lucy's doctoral thesis exploring gender and precarious work under globalization and civil society responses is based on fieldwork in the UK and Chile. Prior to joining Homeworker Worldwide, Lucy worked with Oxfam as well as a researcher at universities in Bradford and Manchester in the UK. Lucy will present why brands should incorporate home workers in their due diligence. Over to you, Lucy.
Hello, thank you, Janhavi, for the introduction, and great to have this opportunity to talk to you all today. And thank you. It's great to hear the previous presentations. It's really helpful to hear from the experience of the grassroots and from Marlies is clear. I think Marlies has made a really strong case for why and how legally we can include home workers in the legislation. And I'm going to speak a little bit about 2 things really. So about focusing on how brands could do due diligence. So I guess what we're saying is not only is this the right thing to do, but it's also doable, it's possible. And here's some examples. So I'm going to talk about a case study of some work that we did on leather footwear with a particular brand in South Asia, and also about some wider research that we've done that's produced a toolkit of tools that is available on the internet for people to use. That is aimed at brands and suppliers, trying to provide templates and practical examples that you can then incorporate and adapt to use in your own supply chains and your own practice. So I'm going to share my slides now, I hope. Hang on. Is that right? Is that working? Yeah, I hope it is.
Yes,
Okay.
that's working.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to go quite quickly through some of these because this is really, I think Marlies has made this point really clearly, the complexity of supply chains. But really this slide is very much to say that even though we know that things are complicated, human rights should be extended and made available to every worker within the supply chain. And I think really to echo that point, we have a thing that we used to say that if you can, if you organise your home workers, if you get right down to home workers, you know that you've got everybody within the supply chain. So it's not just home workers, it's also the contract workers that may be in factories, that may work in small workshops. So making that point that it's right along the chain. But also just quickly to run through some of the more business case reasons for tackling home workers, including home working within your due diligence. So I think prevalence, I think Marlies again made that point really clearly. 11% of women workers work in their homes. 28% of the female workforce in Pakistan work in their homes. So if you're doing due diligence, it's an important section of the labour force that needs to be included. I think it's also worth saying it's not just South Asia, it's also, I mean, we've heard of home working in China, in Vietnam, in Italy, Bulgaria, even in the UK. So home working is used in many different chains. But I think it's also home workers are likely to be the lowest paid women workers within your chains. And that low pay increases risk of other abuses. It means that because home workers are very low paid, they may be tempted to involve in terms of helping with their work. Because their work is very irregular, if they're offered work, a large order that they can't complete, they may well be tempted to take it and work very long hours, and they have very little choice in that matter. So that's getting towards forced labour. So it is if home working is continuing unregulated, it's a serious risk. I think again, as home workers, so many home workers are women, it's a really important part of a gender positive due diligence strategy. And I think is also, if you're thinking about a gender, we know that a lot of the gendered issues within supply chains are linked to women's lack of progression within the labour force. The fact that very few women go beyond the factory floor into more supervisory roles. And I think if it could be seen as a regulated good system of employment, it would be a way of keeping women workers within the labour force as they get older, as they marry and have children. And then as the children grow up, it might be possible for them then to progress and come back into the factory, maybe to take up more senior roles. But I think if there isn't, we know that many women leave at that point. And so home working is a way of keeping those links going. Okay, so just to speak briefly about, I think the work we've done on leather footwear has been described in quite a lot of context, so I won't labour the point, but really we, in 2016-17, we did some work with a particular brand, and that was in response to many years really of campaigning about the conditions of home workers stitching shoes in leather footwear. And we'd found home workers in almost every continent doing hand stitching work in the leather footwear sector. So in South Asia, but also in South America, in Eastern Europe, and in Southern Europe too, in Italy and Spain. So it is a common production process. Typical home working conditions, women workers being rate. But they're doing highly skilled work. They're producing a high quality product. And these are stable supply chains. It's a core part of the production process. So a particular brand took our research report to their supplier, and I think probably said, I'm sure you don't use home workers, do you? The supplier actually said, well, actually we do. For some of your styles of shoes, we have hand seams on the shoes, and yes, home workers are involved in that production. So we were then able to go through a process of negotiation. I mean, it did take quite a long time. We were lucky enough to be in contact with a local civil society organisation that had contacts in that area and was able to set up a little workers' centre to reach out to the home workers, but actually to map all the stages within the chain. So it wasn't just doing interviews with the home workers. We did interviews with the person in the factory that was putting the work out to the agents. We then interviewed the agents, understood their situation and how were they being paid, what were their priorities, and then through that went down to the home workers. So a needs assessment was done of the home workers, so that again you understood their situation. A lot of them were on very low incomes and substantially owing substantial amounts of money to external lenders. Following that initial mapping process, we did a value chain mapping that was following specific styles of shoe. And I think, there's been some questions in the chat really around how can you link home workers' pay to minimum wage rates? Ideally to living wage rates. That is by doing a particular value chain map following particular styles of shoe. You can then you can ask a home worker, right, if you do this particular shoe, how long does it take you to do that shoe? How many of them can you do in a day? And how many hours of work is that? And actually, when we did that study, we produced some evidence that suggested payment rates were too low. The brand then worked with the supplier to do a time and motion study. And that was, again, to be done in the conditions that the home workers are working in, not doing a time and motion study in the factory, but a time and motion study in the workers' homes, and to take timing several different home workers, and then linking those timings to the minimum wage rate. And there was, following that, I think the process that we went through, I think we were also able to document the informal systems of monitoring of the work that were taking place. And then in terms of the next step was to bring the stakeholders together and look at how can we make that slightly more formal. And so again, the supplier was able to draw up a job card system that was very similar to what Mary was describing right at the beginning, to be used to document the work that both the home worker and the agent would sign, to keep a record of work being left with the home worker, the piece rate, so that there was a record that could then be monitored. I think that value chain mapping also included purchasing practices. So we did some interviews also with the buyers to understand how they were planning the orders and liaising with the supplier. Okay. Just to moving out from that particular case study, we did some work leading up to the toolkit. We interviewed other practitioners working on that were trying to work on home working within particular supply chains. So these slides really are about the barriers to transparency that came out of those interviews. So I think, the key thing really is to enable suppliers to disclose that home workers are present. And I think if brands have a ban on home working, or if brands give out mixed messages that dealing with home working is complicated and challenging, then inevitably suppliers they want to get the orders, and supplier will say we don't have any home workers. So I think the first step really is a recognition that home working may well be present, and that's okay, that workers are recognised as workers, and we need to look at their conditions and involve them in due diligence processes. I think without that openness, I mean, home workers are, I mean, yes, it's great. There's some really good examples that home workers are coming together to organise. But in situations where home workers are not organised, they are very, very vulnerable. They're often hidden. They're by definition isolated. And therefore, it's very difficult for them to raise their voices without that recognition, those opportunities. I will through that one. So this slide really is highlighting the dangers. On the left, cycle of denial and concealment. So very much if brands have a ban on home working, inevitably suppliers take on the message, we can't talk about home workers, and that message gets passed down the chain, and so it becomes even more difficult. Subcontractors also don't talk about home workers. Auditors don't discover about home workers. And then home workers are even more hidden and more isolated, and their conditions are likely to get even worse. So that's the cycle when things can get even more difficult. Whereas if we have a clear policy, if we have a clear commitment from brands that are allowed to be in supply chains, and a commitment from the brand to work with suppliers to address any conditions, any short conditions, then we can actually, home workers will be made visible, and we can all work together to improve the situation. This is just really emphasising some of those points, really. The key facilitators of that transparency are, first of all, the home worker policy, the strong relationships between brands and suppliers. So I think one of the reasons the leather footwear worked well was because there was a long-standing relationship. This was the core product that the brand had been making for many years and was likely to continue to make. So there was an investment on both sides, and a level of trust. I think brand purchasing practices are really important. So again, this particular brand had looked at its purchasing practices, had a system for scheduling orders, maintaining those links, and trying to remove or reduce the last minute changes in orders, which, as we know, is so difficult for suppliers to cope with. And then finally, the final stage of that jigsaw really was about how do you go about actually mapping these supply chains? If a supplier does disclose home working, what do you do about it? And really there, it is about working with local civil society organisations in order to map those conditions. It's very difficult for brands or suppliers and auditors to go beyond the factory. And I think there's the community, the issues within the community. You may well need the help of the local organisation to help you in terms of language, in terms of cultural issues. So it is that stakeholder engagement is really important. About how do we make due diligence last? How do we make it sustainable? So the 3 points really that came out from not only from our own work, but also from the interviews with other practitioners, the importance of actively involving home workers, so that there can be a dialogue, and that home workers can be involved in that process. I think oftentimes the conditions may fall short in many different ways. And then it's really important that the home workers are involved in prioritising what's the most important concern for them at the moment. Actively involving home workers also means there's a way for them to raise a grievance. And it also means that if changes are instituted, there's also a possibility of making sure that those changes are maintained. I mean, the second really important way to make things sustainable is trying to find ways to scale up from a particular supply chain to a sector-wide process. And here we see there's a really important role for multi-stakeholder initiatives. because they can bring a number of brands sourcing from a particular location together. And I think that's sustainable because supply chains do change. And so 1 month home workers might be working for one brand, next month it might be a different brand. It is really important to try and get as many different brands to work together and to have a similar policy and similar messages so that we can improve the actual practice within the whole sector. Okay, so most of these points have already been covered, but really very much to say that through the work that we've been doing with the Hidden Home Workers Programme to produce this toolkit, which is available on our website, trying to bring together best practice that different organisations have been working on this particular issue. So there are many different tools that have already been produced. There are templates for home worker policies, there are templates for interviews with supply chain actors, there's model memorandum of understanding for drawing up supply chain mapping projects. So there's a whole lot. There's also resources looking at how do you set fair piece rates, what kind of simple tools can be used around transparency, so job card systems or notebooks. How can you make those systems into things that can work and that can be more sustainable and easy to use, but also practical, and that work for the home workers as well as the other stakeholders in the supply chain. Okay, this really is a summary of what I've been saying. I think in the interest of time, yeah, this is really a little bit of a plug for the Hidden Home Workers project that we're currently working on with Traidcraft and HomeNet South Asia, and with partners in Save in South India, but also Sabre and HomeNet Pakistan. And really very much to encourage brands to take up these opportunities that because the links with ourselves, but also crucially with the local civil society organisations in country, there is an opportunity to get to work with organisations to do that supply chain mapping.
Lucy, sorry, you'll have to wrap up. Sorry, we're running out of time.
Sure, yeah, okay. Right, well, I can leave it there then, or I think I really just trying to draw out a few thoughts for the mandatory due diligence thing, but we can come back to that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. That was a very interesting presentation again, followed by Marlise's presentation, and actually, plugged in very well. So I quite like that fact. And, I really like this message that you had, that brands can't have this mixed messaging about home workers. It further confuses the suppliers, and that's where the issue starts, snowballing further. And, I also like the fact, you've put these points about facilitators of transparency. Very important slide where you talk about 4 things: home worker policy, strong relationship between brands and home workers, brand purchasing practices, and mapping supply chains. Now, we don't have too much time, but there are a few questions. So maybe, Lucy, we should start with you, because, it's a very related question that we have here. One of our audience members has asked that in the absence of strong relationship, is there any way to find out who the home workers work for? And she's mentioned in identifying the supply chains, reference to open apparel registry. She's also asked, can we leverage the public information in OAR or supply home workers information there?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it is a real. I think this is the real challenge, and this is why it's really good that WIEGO are pushing for the for contracts that actually mention the brand name. So I mean, in the absence of that, which is how it is at the moment, it's a kind of detective process. But I mean, I think if if local civil society organisations are really rooted within a local community and they are working with home workers and with other supply chain actors. So, I mean, for example, I know Mary's work with SAVE. They have been working with that textile sector for many, many, many years. So that it's not that they're going to be able to do it quickly. I mean, the first 10 home workers they interview probably will have no knowledge whatsoever of where their work is coming from. But if they keep in touch with those workers, eventually people will get lucky. Eventually, somebody, somebody's brother will be the agent that drops the work off, and that agent will say, oh, this comes from that particular place, or there'll be a box with a label on, or an address of a factory. So it's kind of, it's trying to help the local CSO, it's trying to help the home worker, to help them to understand the importance of mapping that chain. And I think due diligence work is about, part of due diligence is making that process easier, isn't it? So, I mean, yes, things like open apparel registries are really, really helpful. And so certainly, I'm just thinking there's some, I was looking last week of some work that's been done, again, more recent work on leather footwear, where, a few of the home workers knew some of the names of factories. So obviously from that, you can then go up and identify which brands might be sourcing. But I mean, it's not an easy process.
Right. Thanks a lot, Lucy, for that. And Zara Ji, you've already written that answer, but for the larger audience here, there was a question. It's for the calculation of fair wages, we have a method we use to calculate fair wages for piece rate workers using time motion studies. However, we also recognize that there are many challenges to truly calculate a fair wage, which presents issues for our vendors. How do you all recommend setting fair wages for piece rate workers? If you could answer that.
Do you want me to answer that? Or?
Sorry, Zara Ji?
Sorry, Zara Ji. Yeah.
Sorry,
Hello.
apologies. Yes, Zara Ji.
Should I speak now?
Yes, please.
Hello.
Hello, Zara Ji. We can hear you.
This is also the difficult question to answer. We can use the time and motion study as well, but the method which we used to calculate the glass bangle wages was that we went to different areas and we find out the minimum the worker are getting this for the same work and the maximum in any area they are getting for the same work. So which will include the time as well, that in how many time they are completing the certain product, or how many product they are producing in 1 minute or in 1 hour. We have calculated all these things to fix the glass bangle workers wages. So all these things we have taken in account, or you can say we have considered these things to fix the minimum wage. Now what we are doing with the bangle, with the calculation of garment workers, we are adding 2-3 things, very important things which we skip in the calculating in the glass bangle workers. So the cost of the transportation. Secondly, we are also calculating or you can say we will also write or asking with the home-based workers that how many costs they have, or you can say that production costs like material maintenance of the tools, or how many hours they are working, what is the overtime, how many time they are working, even the health benefit if they get sick, or how many
Thank you, Zara Ji.
Hello.
I think yes. Now
hello.
we can hear you. Hi. Now
Okay.
we can hear you. Sorry,
So
we lost you.
Okay, so these are the main things which now we are focusing on calculating the garment sector's wages.
Thank you, Zara Ji. I should also point out that in our audience we have Indira Hirve, and she's done a lot of work around time motion study. So thank you for joining us. And I'm sure you should also, people should look up at her work around time motion study and home-based workers. My next question is for Mary. Mary, there's a question. It's what do home workers need for human rights due diligence legislation? Mary, you there?
Yes, I'm there. Kindly repeat once again the questions.
Yeah.
The first is
what do home workers need from human rights due diligence legislation?
First, they have to be included in the due diligence process. That itself one kind of recognitions. Second thing, all the whatever the standard we are fixing for the regular factory workers, the same thing have to be applied for the home workers, including, for example, working hours, time, a wage, payment of wages, and all these, particularly social security benefits, which is very, very important for them. So in this aspect, the due diligence have to be continued.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. And there are many questions, and we would have liked to ask the same question to all panelists. But now we'll take last question asked by Indira ji again. Marlies, if you could answer that. She's asked, I agree that there is a need to go beyond a factory, but will the brands accept home workers as their workers? And especially when they are spread across different countries.
Thank you. That's such an excellent question. And of course, I completely agree with you. They won't. I mean, they don't even accept factory workers as their workers. And so I think that this is where consumers need to care about home workers, and alliances at the national level, regional level, the transnational level are so incredibly important. So at the national level, for trade unions not to see home workers as competition, but that there's, informalities along a continuum in the supply chain with some people in factories and others outside of factories. And at the transnational level, I want to just give a quick example. I know Neva's on this call today, but the Clean Clothes Campaign is an incredible network of 200 organizations. And I mean, many of us know the work they do in the context of Europe, and they're one of the Brussels-based NGOs that have put a lot of pressure on the supply chain. Sorry, I'm watching the chat, over 250. And they put pressure on the EU Commission. And so it's been a really important thing. WIEGO is part of the Clean Clothes Campaign, and SAVE and Home-Based Workers from Federation from Pakistan and some of the regional HomeNet organizations. And it means that we get information on the processes, and it also means we can feed some bottom-up issues into the network. And so these transnational alliances are incredibly important. And I do think one of the reasons why the Commission, and Neva, you should speak here, the draft directive includes the whole chain is because of the work of the coalitions, the NGO coalition in Brussels. And it's because of their network sensibility, as it were. So let me leave it there. Maybe Neva wants to jump in.
Right. Thanks a lot, Marlies here. And actually, Neva's also put their response to the draft directive. They're very quick. So I think we also need to go through that and have some response to that. There are quite a lot of issues. We agree with Clean Clothes Campaign, and maybe we should also point those out. So thanks a lot, Marlies, for that. We don't have much time. We have exactly 6 minutes to wrap up. So I'm going to do that quickly. And it's difficult to close such an interesting session where we've talked about a lot of various, we've touched upon various aspects of this issue. But maybe just a few key messages that we can take away from this session. And the first one is that all of you spoken, is home workers are part of global supply chains and they make the clothes we all wear. So not recognizing them and not including them in the due diligence mechanism is not only a labor rights violation, but also a human rights violation. The second is home workers are organized. We've all talked, it's not just Pakistan, India. Someone asked about Bangladesh. They are organized and they're stakeholders in supply chains. Enterprises should ensure meaningful engagement with all workers and the organizations at all tiers of supply chains during each stage of due diligence process, be it identifying, preventing, mitigating, and remedying human rights violations. And inputs by worker organizations should be sought at every stage of the design and implementation of grievance mechanism. Fourth is, which, Marlies has given a lot of inputs on why the mandatory due diligence legislation must include home workers, and very crisp 4-point thing she's put together. So we need to take that away. And lastly, which, and a very practical one, which Lucy's talked about, one is that, of course, Module 12 of OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Supply Chain in Garment and Footwear Sector outlines how home workers can be included. And now what Lucy's presented is the toolkit. It provides the practical tools for brands. So I think maybe we should stop here. There was a lot of discussion, but we have very clear messages coming out of this panel. And we should take this forward and continue engaging with each other. There's Nest, there's Clean Clothes Campaign. A lot of audience members have made this session so interactive. Thank you for joining us for this important session. Thank you to all the panelists, Sister Zara, Sister Mary, Marlies, Lucy. This was a very enriching session for all of us. Thank you to all the partners who've supported us with this panel. Thank you to all the interpreters. Thank you to the backend team, and thank you to everyone for joining. Take care, keep safe, and we should all meet soon. Thank you.